Okay, so we'll be starting with the proposition speeches first. I'll go first since my speech is shorter. Okay. Okay. So good. I won't time myself if that's fine. Yeah. Good evening. I'm going to be speaking in. I'm going to be giving a proposition speech on why voting should be made mandatory. As you all know, voting is the cornerstone of democracy. Yet, voter turnout often falls below what is needed to truly reflect the will of people. Making voting mandatory is a vital step towards strengthening our democratic systems. Firstly, mandatory voting ensures inclusivity. It compels citizens from all demographics to participate, reducing the disproportionate influence of specific groups. This leads to decisions that better represent the diversity of our societies. Secondly, it cultivates civic responsibility. Just as paying taxes or serving on a jury is a duty, so too is voting. A mandatory system encourages citizens to educate themselves on issues, fostering a more informed and engaged population. Lastly, it addresses voter apathy. Countries like Australia, where voting is compulsory, consistently achieve turnout rates above 90%, ensuring a more legitimate and robust democratic process. Democracy thrives when everyone's voice is heard. So let's not leave it to a chance. Let us make it mandatory. Thank you. Pranad, you can speak now. I'm just going to put
Yeah,
a timer here.
It is
I
first
would
it's
start on my self
opposition then
counter.
proposition.
Yeah, I guess first proposition, then opposition,
Yeah,
again
good.
proposition, opposition.
Yeah.
So may I speak now?
Yeah. Okay, I'm starting your time in three, two, one.
Just a minute, just a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. Today, we are asked to consider whether voting should be mandatory or not. While the intention behind this proposal may be to ensure a more engaged electorate, I stand firmly against the motion for several important reasons: personal freedom, quality of vote, and the potential of unintended consequences. First, let's address the fundamental issue of personal freedom. In a democratic society, one of our most cherished rights is the ability to make choices, including the choice of whether or not participating in the political processes. By making voting mandatory, we would be infringing on the basic freedom. Citizens should not be compelled to participate in an election if they feel uninformed, uninterested, or simply disengaged. Democracy is not about coercion. It is about the freedom to make decisions, and that includes the right to abstain from voting. Second, mandatory voting could result in a less informed electorate. Imagine for a moment a person who is not engaged with political issues or parties, sorry, if forced to vote, they may simply select a candidate or a party at random or make a choice on superficial factors rather than thoughtful deliberation. Same thing happened in Mon of Nagaland. Instead of empowering the electorate, it aligned a significant portion of population. This could degrade the quality of vote, leading to outcomes that do not truly reflect the will of an informed and engaged electorate. A democratic system relies on voters who are knowledgeable and committed to making their choices responsibly. By mandating participation, we
Your
risk.
time is up. Please conclude.
Okay. In conclusion, while the desire to increase voter turnout is understandable, making voting mandatory is not the solution. It infringes on personal freedom, risks lowering the quality of electoral decisions, and could have negative practical and societal consequences. Let us focus on fostering a more informed, engaged electorate through voluntary means, not through compulsion. Thank you.
Okay, Pranad, you can start.
Yeah, I would start on my self count of three, two, one. Ladies and gentlemen, Today, we gather to discuss a crucial question that lies in the heart of our democratic systems. Should voting be mandatory? I stand firmly in favor of this motion, and I am here to convince you why. Imagine a world where every citizen feels it's their duty, not just their right, to participate in shaping their country's future. This is not just a fantasy, it's a reality in several countries around the world. In Australia, for instance, compulsory voting has been in place since 1924, resulting in astonishing turnout of about around 90% of all registered voters, compared to the UK, where turnout hovers just under 65%. The argument against compulsory voting often centers on the idea that it infringes upon personal freedoms. However, let's clarify. Compulsory voting does not force you to vote for a particular candidate. It only ensures that you participate in the democratic process. You can still submit a blank ballot if you choose not to support any candidate. International human rights law supports the idea that voting is not just a right but a fundamental aspect of civic duty. Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that every citizen has the right to and the opportunity to participate in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives. This article emphasizes that any restrictions on voting must be based on objective and reasonable criteria, not arbitrary or discriminatory. Compulsory voting is not just about coercing people, it's about creating a culture where civic engagement is the norm. It ensures the voice of every citizen is heard, particularly those who socio-economically disadvantaged groups who often feel marginalized from the electoral process. By making voting compulsory, we level the playing field and make our democracy representative. To those who argue that compulsory voting is a overreach of government power, I ask, is it not the government's duty to ensure that all the citizens have an equal say in their governance? Just as we have laws require parents to educate their children and drivers to wear seatbelts, compulsory voting is another civic duty that enhances the well-being of a society as a whole. In conclusion, compulsory voting is not just a restriction, it's an empowerment. It is a call to action that makes our democracy stronger, more inclusive, and more legitimate. Let us follow the example of countries that have successfully implemented compulsory voting and create a society where every voice is heard. Together, we can build a more robust and representative democracy. Thank you.
Okay. Pranjali, you can start in 3, 2, 1.
Greetings, everyone. I strongly oppose the idea of making voting mandatory in India. Democracy is about freedom, and that includes the freedom not to vote. Turning voting into a compulsory act takes away this fundamental right and shifts the essence of democracy from choice to compulsion. First, let us consider the consequences of mandatory voting. While it might seem like a solution to low voter turnout, it does not ensure meaningful participation. Many people in India do not have enough information about candidates or political parties. Forcing them to vote might lead to random selections, which undermines the quality of leadership. A higher voter turnout is meaningless if it does not reflect informed and intentional decisions. Next, consider the practical challenges. India is home to millions of eligible voters. Many of them live in remote areas, work as daily wage laborers, or migrate frequently for employment. Imposing fines or penalties on those who cannot vote due to logistical reasons would create more problems than it solves. Should a democracy punish its citizens for circumstances beyond their control? Instead of making voting mandatory, we should address the reason why people do not vote. Lack of trust in politicians, the perception that one vote won't make a difference, and the inconvenience of voting process are some of the real issues. By tackling these problems, we can encourage voluntary and meaningful participation. Finally, let us remember that democracy thrives on engagement, not enforcement. Countries with successful democracies focus on creating awareness, simplifying voting processes, and empowering citizens to make informed choices. India should follow this
Pranjali,
path.
your time is up. Please conclude.
India should follow this path instead of resorting to compulsion. In conclusion, voting is right, not a duty. It should be exercised willingly, not under pressure. Making voting mandatory is not the solution to India's challenges. Strengthening trust in democracy is. Thank you.
POI.
Yeah, you can now ask each other POIs.
If mandatory voting is seen as an attack on rights and freedom, how do you reconcile this with with the fact that many democratic countries like Australia have successfully implemented such systems without eroding democratic values?
Which one of you wants to answer?
Sorry, what?
I asked which one of the opposition wants to answer.
Like, okay, okay, sorry.
Could you please repeat your question?
Yeah. If mandatory voting is seen as an attack on rights and freedom, how do you reconcile this with the fact that many democratic countries like Australia have successfully implemented such systems without eroding democratic values?
Okay, I'll answer this. Australia's population and socio-economic structure are vastly different from India's. India's challenges, such as poverty, illiteracy, and a large migrant population, make compulsory voting impractical and unfair.
Follow up.
Yeah, you can follow.
Like, what is the relation between poverty and, because suppose if poverty is there, the people of India can also vote. There are not any like restrictions that if you are this poor, you're not eligible to vote. You are mentioning the wrong answer. What do you say upon this?
Also, today's motion was should voting be made mandatory, not should voting be made mandatory in India. So, just to.
Yeah, so poor people don't have access to the same resources as we do. In remote areas, people might not know about candidates, as I mentioned in my speech. So they would vote. So just a second, let me. Mm, yes, as mentioned, many people in
Is
India
your
do.
question mainly would mandatory voting encourage greater political awareness and engagement? Hello.
Sorry, what?
Um,
I asked the question that if mandatory voting is seen as an attack on rights and freedom, how do you reconcile this with the fact that many democratic countries like Australia have successfully implemented such systems without eroding democratic values?
So you had a follow-up to which I'm answering, Pranath.
may I
But
answer
Kashvi,
the
okay, yeah, cool.
follow-up?
Gosh, we have already answered this. You need to answer the poverty one.
Okay. So Australia is one of the most notable examples of a country with mandatory voting. But Australia has consistently had high vote turnout rates, often above 90%. This policy led to a more representative government with high levels of citizen engagement in political process. Despite some initial concerns, Australia's experience shows that mandatory voting cannot strengthen democracy and lead to more inclusive electoral outcomes.
So basically, you're in support of my fact.
No.
Oh,
Pranath,
sorry,
answer
in
your
support of the
follow-up
motion.
now. Pranath, I'll answer your follow-up now.
Arre, arre, she
She was
answered.
off topic. She was off
She
topic.
answered a question. She was
Yeah,
she
I
was
even
for
said
the
it.
motion while
Yeah,
she
I
answered.
follow-up. Yeah, she was off topic. She was
Uh,
off topic right now.
yeah, she was off topic, but that was still her answer. So we need to move on to the next POI now, as we don't have time.
Cool, cool. Yes, okay.
Does the opposition have any POIs?
Just a second. I am framing my POI.
Till then, I have a POI.
Okay, let the opposition ask a POI and then.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I have a POI.
Yeah.
How can we address voter apathy and disengagement without making voting a legal obligation?
Pranad, would you want to answer?
Like, so your question basically means that are there any other ways to increase voter turnout and engagement that do not involve compulsory voting?
Yeah.
Just a sec. Okay, while there are other methods to increase voter turnout, such as voter education campaigns and electoral reforms, compulsory voting has shown to be one of the most effective ways to ensure high and consistent voter participation. It addresses the root issue of low turnout directly and ensures that all citizens have an equal say in governance.
I have a P.
I also have it.
Okay. Guys, for now first Pranad will ask his POI, then Pranjal will ask it, and try to not ask too many follow-ups since we're running out of time.
Yeah, yeah, okay. If the right to free speech includes the right to not speak, why should the right to vote not include the obligation to participate the democratic process, especially when it can be done in a way that respects conscientious obligations such as allowing voters to spoil their ballots?
Can you tell your question in conclusion?
Thought on your question, it was quite long.
No, it wasn't. Okay. Anyways, if the right to speech includes the right to not speak, why should the right to vote not include the obligation to participate in the democratic process, especially when it can be done in a way that respects conscientious obligations, such as allowing voters to spoil their ballots, whatever. I guess we have less time remaining. So, if
Okay.
possible, I can share a meeting link on the main group.
Yeah, you can just rejoin the same meeting link. It's fine. We'll try to conclude in the new meeting.
I'll
Okay,
try to answer your question, Pranath. So, the so we are in a democracy. People here have right to vote and not to vote. We cannot, put some pressure on put pressure on them to vote. We cannot make it mandatory for them to vote. Okay, and if we make it mandatory for them to vote, it would be against the principles of democracy.
could you please say some of the principles that are going against the democracy?
And even I have a POI. You are already having a follow-up.
I
Yeah,
guess we can conclude it after like rejoining as there is only 1 minute left.
yeah. We'll go with Pranjal's POI now, because I don't think there's time for follow-up.
So my POI is, if democracy is based on freedom to choose, how can forcing citizens to vote be justified? Does this not contradict the very principle of democracy?
Okay, so while it is true that compulsory voting, sorry, okay, yeah, you mentioned about the Freedom Acts, right? So while we like make voting compulsory, the candidates also have an option to submit a blank ballot if they choose not to support any.
Pranad, you can continue your answer.
Yeah, just a sec, okay. Yeah. So the burden of proof is indeed a valid concern, but it can be argued that the benefits of compulsory voting, such as higher turnout, more representative democracy, and reduced polarization, provide a compelling justification. International human rights law also supports the notion that voting is a fundamental aspect of civic duty, and you can't miss upon the increased voter turnout. Plus, candidates have an option to choose to submit a blank ballot if they choose not to support any candidate. This ensures Just sorry, where is it? This ensures participation in the democratic process without coercing a specific vote or any fundamental right.
Okay, moving on to the rebuttal speeches. This time opposition goes first. You guys have 90 seconds each. Opposition, proposition, opposition, proposition. Let me just start my time. Okay, so which member of the opposition wants to start first?
I'll start first.
Okay, you can start in 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, just a minute, please. Yeah, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So, we have heard the argument in favor of mandatory voting today, but I stand firmly in opposition, and I will now address and rebut some of the points raised by my respected colleagues. First, they argue that mandatory voting ensures higher voter turnout and thus a more respective democracy. While this may sound appealing in theory, it overlooks the quality of the vote. Forcing people to vote doesn't necessarily make the election more democratic, it just increases the number of ballots cast. Secondly, my opponents argue that mandatory voting fosters greater political engagement, but this point is deeply problematic. Forcing people to vote does not guarantee that they will become more informed or more politically engaged. In fact, it may do the opposites. Next, they argue that mandatory voting promotes equality in the political process. However, equality in a democracy is not about forcing everyone to vote. Last, Lastly, while the intention behind mandatory voting is to increase voter turnout and create a more engaged electorate, the reality is far more complex. Risks creating a shallow form of
Prashni, your time is up.
participation.
Please conclude.
Yeah, I'm concluding only. Where citizens vote out of obligation, not general interests. It could lead to informed voting, resentment towards the political system, and inequality for those who face barriers to participation. Instead of coercing people into voting, we should focus on improving voter education, accessibility, and engagement so that people vote because they care, not because they are forced to. Thank you.
Should I go?
Yeah, you can go.
So I would start on my self count of 3, 2, 1. To those who argue that compulsory voting infringes on individual liberty and freedom of choice, I pose a simple question: Is the right to vote not also a civic duty in a democratic society? The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights emphasizes the participating in the conduct of the public affairs is a fundamental right, but also implies a responsibility. Critics suggest that compulsory voting leads to ununiformed or random votes, but this overlooks the educational effect it can have. When voting is seen as a civic duty, citizens are more likely to educate themselves on the candidates and issues. In Australia, for example, despite some instances of donkey ballots, the overall engagement and the legitimacy of the democratic processes have significantly improved. Moreover, the compulsory voting does not force you to vote for a particular candidate. It only ensures participation. You can still submit a blank ballot if you choose not to vote any candidate. This system has been shown to minimize political polarization and ensure that governments better represent the will of the people rather than just the interests of a vocal minority. Let's not confuse the right to choose with the duty to participate. Compulsory voting is not about restricting freedom, but about enhancing democracy and ensuring every voice is heard. Thank you.
Okay. Pranjal, you can start.
Yeah, I'll start on the self count of 3, 2, 1. My opponents argue that making voting mandatory will increase turnout and strengthen democracy. But more votes do not guarantee better governance. Forcing people to vote doesn't mean they will make informed decisions. Instead, it will risk random or careless voting, which can harm our democratic process. They also ignore struggles of many Indians like daily wage workers and migrants who often cannot afford to vote because of time, travel, or financial issues. Punishing them for not voting would be unfair and discriminatory. Democracy is about freedom, including freedom not to vote. Choosing not to vote can also be a way of expressing dissatisfaction with the system. Making voting compulsory takes away this freedom and weakens the idea of democracy. Instead of forcing people, we should focus on educating voters, building trust, and making voting easier. This will encourage informed and willing participation, which is far more valuable. Thank you.
Okay. I'll start now in 3, 2, 1. So the opposition has stated that making voting mandatory abolishes the ideal of democracy by not giving people a choice. But one of the main ideals of democracy is that the government is chosen by the people, right? So this further emphasizes that right of people by making sure that not only a few number of people's opinions are heard, right? And also, democracy is not just about rights, it's also about responsibilities. Voting is the cornerstone of a functioning democracy, and mandatory voting ensures every citizen contributes to the decisions shaping the future. As for freedom, mandatory voting doesn't force a choice, it simply ensures participation. Citizens can always cast a blank or null vote if they feel unrepresented. Lastly, countries like Australia demonstrate that when mandatory voting leads to inclusive governance without compromising individual rights. Mandatory voting strengthens the democracy and we must embrace it. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude the debate. I'm going to be neutral for this, okay, as the one hosting the debate. Okay, so first point is don't exceed this time limit. Very basic point. Second point, always go through your speech before you say it or even your answers to POIs because you might end up supporting what the opposition is saying, right? Yeah, those are the 2 points I felt to mention. So with that, we'll conclude today's debate. Thank you for joining.